Have you ever wondered what dark secrets your seemingly perfect neighbors might be hiding behind closed doors? Discover the chilling tales of the watcher next door, the unnervingly perfect family, and the haunting screams that echo through the night in this spine-tingling collection of true horror stories. Before we start, please like, subscribe, and comment about your neighbor. Have they done anything that has sent chills down your spine? Story 1. The Watcher Next Door. The first time I saw him, it was just a fleeting glance, a pale face behind the curtains of the house next door. I thought nothing of it. After all, people were entitled to their privacy, especially in our sleepy suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened. But as days turned into weeks, I began to notice more. Every night, without fail, his silhouette would appear in the same window. His eyes, though I could never truly see them, seemed to burn with an unnatural glow. It wasn't the occasional glance of a curious neighbor, it was a constant, unblinking stare directed at my house. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was an insomniac, passing time by watching the world go by. Maybe he was lonely. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more disturbed I became. I started to dread the setting sun because I knew he would be there waiting. One night, I decided to confront him. I felt a mix of fear and anger as I marched over to his house. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and the streetlights flickered as if they sensed my unease. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still night. He answered almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for me. He was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes were even more unsettling up close, deep pools of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper that sent chills down my spine. "I've noticed you watching my house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's making me and my family uncomfortable." He smiled, a slow, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry if I've caused you any distress. I have a condition that makes it hard to sleep. Watching the world helps pass the time." His explanation was reasonable enough, but something about him still felt off. I nodded, mumbled a thanks, and hurried back to my house, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with an unshakable sense of dread. The next few nights were worse. Not only was he still watching, but I began to hear strange noises, scratches at my windows, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. My wife and kids didn't notice anything unusual, but I was on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of our old house. One particularly restless night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart pounded as I crept out of bed, clutching a baseball bat. The house was dark, the only light coming from the full moon outside. I followed the sound to the living room, where I froze in horror. There in the center of the room was my neighbor. His eyes glowed eerily in the moonlight, and he was muttering something under his breath. The words were unintelligible, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Get out," I shouted, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression calm, almost serene. "It's too late," he whispered. "I've been invited in." Before I could react, he vanished, leaving behind only a cold chill and a lingering sense of doom. I searched the house, but there was no sign of him. My family remained asleep, unaware of the terror that had unfolded. The next day, I went to the police, but they found no evidence of a break-in. My neighbor denied everything, his polite smile never wavering. I was left feeling like I was losing my mind. As the days passed, the watching continued, but now it felt more sinister. My family started to act strangely. My wife grew distant. My children had nightmares and spoke of a shadowy figure visiting them at night. Desperate, I decided to move. We packed our things, leaving behind the house that had become a prison of fear. On our last night, as I loaded the final box into the car, I glanced back at the neighbor's house. His silhouette was there, watching as always. But this time I saw something that made my blood run cold. Reflected in his eyes was not just the glow of some strange light, but the faces of my family, twisted in expressions of terror. We left that night, but the nightmares followed us. No matter where we went, I could always feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. The house next door had been more than just a home to a strange neighbor. It was a gateway to something dark and unending. And I had unwittingly opened the door. Story 2. The perfect family. When the Stevenses moved in next door, they seemed like the ideal neighbors. The father, Mark, was a charming man with an easy smile. His wife, Ellen, was beautiful and gracious. Their twin children, Emma and Ethan, were always well-behaved and polite. They were the perfect family, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy as I watched them from my kitchen window. At first, it was small things that made me uneasy. The way they moved in perfect unison, for example, like a well-rehearsed dance. Their synchronized laughter at neighborhood gatherings, always a beat too perfect. But I dismissed these thoughts as jealousy. After all, they seemed genuinely kind, always offering to help with yard work or inviting me over for dinner. One evening, I accepted their invitation. The house was immaculate, every piece of furniture perfectly in place, the air scented with lavender. As we sat down to dinner, I noticed something strange. They all took bites of their food at the exact same time, chewed with the same rhythm, and even set their forks down in unison. It was unsettling, but I forced myself to smile and join the conversation. As the night wore on, my discomfort grew. The Stevenses seemed to know everything about me, details I hadn't shared with them. They asked about my work, my family, my favorite hobbies, with an intensity that felt intrusive. And all the while, their eyes never left mine, their identical smiles never faltered. After dinner, Mark suggested we have coffee in the living room. As we sipped our drinks, Ellen excused herself to check on the children. Moments later, she returned and the twins followed, their movements perfectly synchronized. They sat on the couch, their eyes fixed on me with unsettling intensity. "You have a lovely home," I said, trying to break the tension. "Thank you," Mark replied. "We've worked hard to make it just right." "Perfection is important to us," Ellen added, her smile widening. I nodded, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my back. The atmosphere was suffocating, the perfect family suddenly feeling like a well-orchestrated facade. I made an excuse to leave, thanking them for their hospitality. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were still on me, watching my every move. The following days were even stranger. I noticed the Stevenses in their backyard, standing in a perfect line, staring at my house. They didn't move for hours, their expressions blank, their eyes unblinking. I closed the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. One night, I woke to the sound of soft tapping at my window. I crept to the window and peered out, my breath catching in my throat. There they were, the Stevenses, standing in the moonlight, their eyes glowing faintly. They were smiling, but there was nothing friendly about it. It was a smile that promised something dark and terrible. Terrified, I called the police, but when they arrived, the Stevenses were back in their house, the lights off, the perfect picture of a sleeping family. The officers dismissed my claims as paranoia, suggesting I get some rest. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to investigate. I learned that the house the Stevenses lived in had a dark history. The previous owners had vanished without a trace, and before them, a string of mysterious disappearances. The more I dug, the more I realized that the Stevenses were not who they appeared to be. One night, unable to sleep, I ventured into their backyard. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell. As I approached the house, I saw a faint glow emanating from the basement window. I peered inside and froze. The Stevenses were gathered around a table, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes glowing. On the table were photos of me, my family, my friends, every detail of my life laid out before them. Suddenly they all turned to face me, their smiles widening into something monstrous. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to my house, locking the doors and windows, but I knew it was only a matter of time. As I sat in the dark, trembling with fear, I realized the horrifying truth: the Stevenses weren't just a perfect family, they were something else entirely. something inhuman, feeding on the lives of those who came too close. And now they had set their sights on me. Story 3. The screams next door. The first time I heard the screams, I was jolted awake from a deep sleep. It was a cold, moonless night, and the sound pierced the quiet like a knife. Muffled and desperate, it seemed to come from the house next door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, listening intently. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I had moved to this quiet neighborhood to escape the chaos of the city, seeking peace and solitude. The house next door, a large old Victorian, had been vacant for years until a month ago when a new family moved in. I had only seen them a few times, a middle-aged couple who kept to themselves. There was something about them that felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided to pay them a visit using the excuse of welcoming them to the neighborhood. When I knocked on their door, it took a while for anyone to answer. Finally, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Perkins stood there, her eyes wide and slightly vacant. "Hello," I said, forcing a smile. "I live next door and just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Her lips curled into a stiff smile. "Thank you. That's very kind of you. Is there something you need?" I hesitated, unsure of how to bring up the screams. "Well, actually, I heard some noises last night. It sounded like someone was in distress. Is everything all right?" Her smile faltered, and a shadow crossed her face. "Oh, that. It must have been the plumbing. This old house has a lot of quirks." Something in her tone didn't sit right with me, but I nodded and made my way back home. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes on me, watching until I closed my front door. That night, the screams returned. They were louder and more frantic, sending chills down my spine. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening as they echoed through the walls. Then, I heard something else scratching, like nails dragging across a wooden floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, they listened patiently as I explained what I had heard. They assured me they would check it out and headed next door. I watched from my window as they knocked on the Perkins door. "Mr. Perkins answered this time, looking annoyed but cooperative. The officers spoke with him for a few minutes, then left, shaking their heads. One of the officers approached me. "It's nothing to worry about," he said. "The Perkins said it's just their old dog. He gets anxious at night and makes strange noises. We didn't find anything suspicious." I wanted to believe him, but the screams were too human, too filled with terror. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable sounds. Sure enough, they came, even more horrifying than before. Desperate, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The following evening, as dusk settled, I snuck into the Perkins' backyard. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I crept along the side of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a small, half-open basement window, and through it, I could see a dim light flickering inside. I crouched down and peered in. What I saw made my blood run cold. The basement was filled with cages, and in each one was a person, their faces gaunt and eyes wide with fear. The Perkins were standing in the center of the room, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing at their captives. The screams started again, and this time I could see their source. One of the captives, a young woman, was being dragged to a corner where a set of cruel-looking tools lay spread out on a table. Mrs. Perkins picked up a knife, her expression blank as she approached the woman. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I had to get help, but I knew I couldn't call the police. They hadn't believed me before. I ran back to my house, locked the doors, and dialed the only person I could think of, my brother, a former soldier who lived a few towns over. Within the hour he arrived and I told him everything. His face grew grim and he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Armed with his service pistol, he led the way back to the Perkins house. We approached the basement window again, and he motioned for me to stay quiet. As we watched, he pulled out his phone and recorded the scene inside. The Perkins were still busy with their horrific task, oblivious to our presence. Once he had enough footage, we retreated and called the police again, this time showing them the video. The response was immediate. Within minutes, a SWAT team had surrounded the house. The Perkins were arrested, and their captives were freed, trembling and weak, but alive. As the police led the couple away, I saw Mrs. Perkins glance back at me, her eyes cold and devoid of any humanity. The investigation that followed uncovered a gruesome truth. The Perkins had been abducting people for years, using their basement as a torture chamber. The previous owners of the house had vanished without a trace, victims of the couple's twisted games. Even after their arrest, the nightmares persisted. I could still hear the screams echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of the horror that had unfolded next door. The perfect facade of the Perkins' life had hidden a darkness beyond anything I could have imagined. And though they were gone, the shadows they left behind continued to loom over our quiet neighborhood, a chilling reminder that true evil often hides in plain sight. Thanks for listening. If you have made it this far, please consider subscribing. At the moment, only 3% of people who watch are subscribers. Let's improve this. See you tomorrow.